All right. Jung's answer to Job,
Yeah,
published after Jung had a heart attack in the mid 40s, right? It was a few years before this was published.
yeah.
Um,
So this was published in 52, I think. And he had his second heart attack. So certainly had a real encounter with his own mortality.
mhm.
And yeah, I think he maybe decided at that time he just didn't care, and he didn't care if there would be backlash. And this did torch some of his personal relationships. He was in various ongoing dialogues with theologians, and most notably Victor White, who we've discussed peripherally. I mean, he's the one who Jung writes to about psychedelics. So that famous, we discussed it last time, that famous letter to Victor White about psychedelics, and I'm not sure if they had a really voluminous correspondence, and I'm not sure if it continued after this because he was very offended and published a review, a scathing review.
So Jung seems to me to be trying to mediate between two positions or two worldviews, a secular, rational worldview and who would want to just dismiss the psychology of religion, like might have historical interests, but why would, a purely like secular materialist might want to respond to a book like Answer to Job, like, why are you wasting your time on this? It's not important anymore. But Jung's
Mm.
also trying to speak to theologians and say, hey, this God image is an important feature of our psychology that we really do need to work through, but maybe this harsh dualism between good and evil that your theology is imputing into the divine nature and into human nature, maybe that might be a form of repression, and we might need to, psychoanalyze our theology, psychoanalyze God even, and try to find a different way of relating to this numinous feature of our own psyches.
Mm.
Now, of course, characterizing it in that psychological way is going to be probably misunderstood by the secular materialist and probably felt as a tremendous threat by the theologian or the religious believer, right? And so Jung's caught between these two extremes, and I think trying to mediate.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it actually means that the work itself can be read in kind of multiple registers, right? You can, and there's I find there's a really an oscillatory thing going on in me like psychologically when I'm engaging with this text, that I am constantly being drawn to engage with it in different ways. It can seem very much like Jung is making a lot of sort of directly metaphysical statements, um, or you can bracket that completely and read it from this purely psychological perspective. But really, he's in this liminal zone, and that definitely creates a problem for reception, as you're saying. That who is this text for? In the sense, like it's for everybody, right? But who is actually going to be receptive to it? And I wonder if you and I read it from slightly different sides of that. I think neither of us would consider ourselves at either pole. I'm not at the pole of extreme atheism or secular materialism, but I kind of am on that side. And you're a little bit more, religious I mean, not in a traditional sense, but in a more traditional sense than me, perhaps. I wanted to read a couple of quotes just to begin with, really quickly, and then we can go any which way with this because there's just so much in here. But there's a couple of things that I thought. One of the we talked a little bit about the Buber response, the Martin Buber response to Jung, and some of that is also predicated on this text as well. Like this is right when that's happening or about to happen, and certainly Jung refers to gnosis a number of times, and he also, I mean, he identifies, implicitly, but it's there throughout the text. Sophia. With the Holy Spirit, right? And that's a very Gnostic idea. So he queers or feminizes the Holy Spirit in a way that is, yes, it's a Gnostic trope. So, Buber might have been reacting to that partly, but also given the conversation surrounding Jung psychologizing as though that's a reductive move. There's a quote here which is You have to forgive me, it's from beyond the part that we were planning to focus on today, but it's just a really apposite quote, I think, to tie it to our discussion of his reception last week. So he says, psychologism represents a still primitive mode of magical thinking, with the help of which one hopes to conjure the reality of the soul out of existence, after the manner of the procto-phantasmist in Faust. Quote from Faust, "Are you still here? Nay, it's a thing unheard. Vanish at once, we've said the enlightening word." So Jung's drawing on Goethe's, satire of eliminative reductionism there, and he says he then finishes quite strongly. One would be very ill-advised to identify me with such a childish standpoint. So Jung fully anticipates, and I mean, it's obviously been happening to him throughout much of his career, but he anticipates this criticism that you are psychologizing and reducing this, these images or these noumenal realities just to psychology. And he's saying, no, 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 if you think that, you're reading me way wrong. And then the other thing that I wanted to really quickly mention is it's a footnote from somewhere, footnote to paragraph 738, so also beyond where I'm supposed to be referring to today, but it speaks to this. It speaks to something that's come up as a kind of a refrain in our conversations when we're talking about Whitehead and Whitehead's metaphysician's God as well, right? So Jung says, psychologically, the God concept includes every idea of the ultimate, of the first or last, of the highest or lowest. The name makes no difference. So those are some framing quotes, which is, I think, helpful to keep in the background. And also, it's like, why would a secular materialist, if indeed that's what I am, be engaging with a text like this? There are lots of different ways that you can read it, and Jung makes those ways available to us.
Yeah. I think I would myself identify more with Jung than with either pole here, even
Yeah.
though, like Jung, I'm not a Jungian. I would, I would want to be the mediator, and I think psyche for Jung ends up playing the mediating role between spirit and matter, or between science and religion. He really is trying to reintegrate the modern, postmodern psyche by allowing it to take seriously its own spiritual history and also to take seriously the scientific method.
Mhm.
And, there's a sense of urgency in the background of Jung's whole project, which is not, I mean, it parallels Heidegger's in a way. This warning about, the rational ego's attempt to gain technological control over itself and nature. And,
Mm.
Jung sees disaster in that project, and I think his reading of the Book of Job is, an attempt to avoid extreme responses to this human situation. I mean, I think one reason a psychologist might be interested in the Book of Job, even if we're not going to psychologize it, would be just to, read Job as an allegory for just the human condition, and that we do have this deep instinct, this moral instinct, to use a paradoxical phrase. I mean, Jung would say it's a moral law, and conscience is something transcendental, as is freedom. But, we seem to be born with an instinct for justice. And where does that come from? So much so that, as it's depicted in Job, there's a sense that despite Yahweh's total lack of trustworthy behavior, and total forgetfulness of his own omniscience, apparently, and complete you know uh, inability to remain in integrity with contracts and covenants which have been signed. You know, Job's response to that, to be moral even in the face of divine wrath, when presumably God was the source of our own moral instinct in the first place. I think that speaks to something deep about the psychology of religion. And again, I don't mean, the psychological reduction of religious experience to, some kind of birth trauma or trauma in childhood or what have you, but the psychology of religion in the sense that every human being, well, at least in Christendom, let's say, and post Christendom, every human being in that part of the world, and that shares that history, would be going through this Job-like experience of conflict and of a sense of a split in the divine nature that splits we ourselves into. And, so approaching that as a psychological situation doesn't need to be reductive. It's just understanding the history of religious experience as it's recorded in books like the Bible as an externalization of an inner conflict that still manifests today. I mean, I love the connection he makes between not only the church split between Catholic and Protestant, but the political split between left and right. He says that this duality in the Godhead between good and evil seems to have this real historical and contemporary effect, or rather expression. Like there seems to be a psychological cause in these archetypes that he's working through in this text for our political maladies and for our disagreement, religious disagreement. That there should be so many different churches, and even we should probably also talk about the Christendom piece and the way in which on some level to even call it the Old Testament is anti-Semitic, as if like, well, Christianity supersedes Judaism. It's like the whole idea of taking Christianity seriously is going to be offensive to Jews, for whom this particular revelation was for them or for us. I mean, I'm kind of ambiguously positioned there, but there's the Jewish claim for specialness and of a relationship to this monotheistic deity, and then there's the Christian claim that no, actually, that's everyone's God. And you might think, well, the Christian claim is more inclusive, but at the same time, it's also saying even Buddhists and Muslims and people of no faith and whatever other forms of pagan and indigenous practice there might be, they all must come to Christ, because the only way to actually live a true human life is to come to Christ through Christ. And so this book is challenging for those who want to locate themselves like emically in this biblical history and culture, and it's challenging for people who are outside of that cultural historical mythos.
Yeah, wow. I mean, it's very hard to respond to that. I mean, you summarized many things really beautifully there. Speaking of it as an allegory, well, treating the book of Job as an allegory, we can also read Answer to Job as an allegory, or as allegories on many different subjects. Again, there are many, many different ways you can read different aspects of this. And in linking it to Heidegger, I mean, we don't want to go too far there, because as we discussed, we want to keep those figures very separate, in the sense that they are sometimes misaligned, inappropriately aligned on certain things, I would say.
They're not fully aligned. They both approach the same problem, though, see the same problem.
Yeah. And so part of it is certainly an allegory about, he gets very explicit in the discussion of Revelation towards the end, which we'll deal with in more detail next time, but he gets very explicit about, the technology, the power that the technology we've developed has granted to us, and the huge responsibility that confers upon us. But that's also there throughout. And in discussion of God's fascination with his creation, and in particular this is drawn out when we're discussing Satan, and how he kind of lets his firstborn, his dark son, get away with all sorts of things, and tends to project Satan's misdeeds onto man. But there's a little section, and I don't think I haven't noted the specific paragraphs, but where he talks about God being blinded by his fascination with his own creation. And in a certain sense, a lot of it, there's this element of shadow projection. God is doing this shadow projection thing, because really Satan is part of God. And Satan is God's shadow in this sense. And
it's a big family feud.
Yeah, it's a big family feud, and he's messing things up But instead of taking responsibility for all of that, God is projecting it onto humans and onto Job specifically in this case. And so there's an allegory there also for family feuds and for relationships in general, and for marriage, which is something that Jung talks about, quite a lot in various contexts, and how, marriage is the most testing kind of relationship, in the sense that, one is so close to somebody, and there's often so much projection going on, and people failing to take responsibility. And one can't help think, again, not to be reductive, a little bit biographically about Jung's life and his very famous challenges in the home, and his multiple mistresses and all these sorts of things, which no doubt created a lot of tensions between him and his wife Emma. So there's all of that.
He even talks about the personal repetition of this pleromatic, archetype of the two wives, that both Adam and Yahweh have two wives, and Jung himself, he didn't have two wives, but he had a wife and a mistress, and
public mistress, of course, Tony Wolfe, in the second half of his life. So there's so much going on, and I'm not responding to half the wonderful things you said. So do we want to look at specifics in the text? I mean, do you have things marked out that you want to us to bounce off? Or I've got copious annotations in my copy, and also I've got a bunch of notes that
we should say something about what he means by psychic facts or psychic truth, and how it's different from physical truth. And he says the physical is not the only criterion of truth. And he's really trying, as like a radical empiricist, I think, to include beliefs as psychological facts that are part of human experience. And so, as an empiricist himself, Jung needs to give some account of beliefs. And if the theologian does theodicy, trying to reconcile divine misbehavior with human expectations, then the psychologist is doing something similar, trying to internal to a human psyche, reconcile our sense of justice, like that our behavior is good, and that we deserve to be treated in certain ways. And when the world doesn't treat us as we expect, how do we remain psychologically whole without being externally mirrored in the way that we might expect from a loving parent, and just the whole child-parent relationship. I think you could do developmental psychology and be very focused on the actual physical development and psychological development of individual children, or you could read the book of Job and read the mythic childhood of God, and the growth of that, it's allegorical, but I think it's also, and it's analogical in like a deeper metaphysical sense, not just a literary sense.
Well, that's what an archetype is, in some sense. It's not a literal conformity to a very specific sequence of events or a specific arrangement of facts, but it is a pattern that is repeated over and over and over again. And he's very keen to point out the naivety of thinking that there can be only physical facts, and then that also ties into the way that he treats myth, and myth not being fiction, which we should probably get to. But in terms of the allegory stuff and developmental psychology, another of the allegories is, of course, the parent-child relationship, and the inappropriateness of the scale of God's response when Job is just this defenseless, puny human in comparison to the omnipotent power of the Almighty God. and what a terror it is to fall into the hands of the living God and all of that. And I think there of a parent raging against an infant as well, you know, and infants do all kinds of things that are very frustrating and of course irrational, to, you know, from the perspective of parents, but parents do sometimes very unfortunately have a very their own irrational reaction to that. And the power balances. I mean, Jung is very cheeky in this, and he makes a lot of fun of. You know, he basically says we can't even imagine the scale of power is so different here between God and Job that this is so unfair, basically, that it's absurd. It's ludicrous for God to have this kind of reaction. And of course, in this case, Job hasn't really even done anything wrong except be very prosperous. You know, he is. It's not really explicitly discussed here, but he is the richest of his people. He's a very, very prosperous guy, but he's a very pious guy. And of course, it all begins with Satan basically saying, you know, well, we'll see how pious he is when we start to, you know, mess around with him. But God does all these horrendous things to him. And then when Job dares to question, he's basically like, who are you to question me? You know, did you create the Leviathan and the behemoth? And he has this massive, puffed up response of pride. You know, I'm so powerful. How dare you question me? And yeah, again, I can see a bit of an allegory. You know, parents reading this would maybe hopefully see, you know, it gives one pause for thought about how one responds to the you know, the transgressions of a child. So there's that allegorical aspect in there, as well. And yeah, go on.
Yeah, and you know just the way in which Yahweh appears unconscious and needs Job as an object to project upon in order to then,
Hmm.
through Job and Sophia apparently as like Job's advocate,
Mhm.
remember that Job was not, you know, Job or God said, Yahweh says to Job, you know, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Like
Yeah.
forgetting that actually, you know, Yahweh, you weren't there by yourself doing it all by yourself. Sophia was there with you.
Yeah.
You had help, actually. Um, and so, you know, this whole entrance of Sophia and the feminine
Yeah.
into, you know, this patriarchal context becomes really important for Jung. And I know the, you know, Annunciation and the idea that Mary is,
Mhm.
you know, to be considered, you know, in heaven and a kind of deity herself, is both a positive sign but also a problematic sign for Jung because, you know, Mary as the second Eve being totally virgin and pure is
Mm.
for Jung incomplete, right? Because for God to fully become human and enter the world, it's not just that you need a human birth, but a birth to a woman who is fully of this world and not, you know,
Well, it's interesting that you say,
perfect.
yeah, it's interesting that you say incomplete there because actually what Jung wants to emphasize is the felicitous incompleteness, or sorry, the felicitous completeness, yeah, of the feminine, as
Yeah.
opposed to the, you know, perfect but sterile masculine. And you know, so he wasn't alone, God, in the creation, because he had Sophia, but of course at the same time, and you know, this gets all very knotty and twisty, and there's also paradox in here. Sophia is an aspect of God as well. So she is a component of his consciousness, so to speak. And of course, she's the anima in a more, you know, archetypal Jungian archetypal psychology sense. And one of the things that the anima does, I mean, the anima is the mediatrix, which is how he also describes Sophia specifically, and mediates between ego and shadow. So is a key part of the coming to consciousness of the darkness within oneself, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
So recognizing that one isn't in fact perfect. So the masculine ideal maybe is this completeness, is sorry, not completeness, is this incompleteness, but that's perfection. And I think there's a really important way, like we'll get into it, this process ontology aspect of this and talking about the pleroma and creativity and all these sorts of things. And some of the stuff that we had a little small back and forth this morning on Twitter about. But yeah, so that's the role of the feminine here is bringing God now as the ego in some sense, God's ego into relationship with God's shadow, which is sort of Satan in this case. But again, this can be read on so many levels because on the one hand, you can talk about, Jung psychoanalyzing God, getting God on the couch and all of that. And there's obviously that aspect. And you can talk about, of course, the psychoanalysis of the image. So he's talking about the image of God, really. He's not, of course, talking about the actual metaphysical God, as he's very clear in many times. So really, it is a psychoanalysis, as you've already suggested, of the religious tradition and of the human representations of God. But whilst he explicitly says many times that God is unconscious and that part of what's going on in this whole series of events is God coming to consciousness, and partly God has to act, has to actualize things to elicit responses from his own unconscious, so to speak, right? So there's an improvisatory element here. He throws something at the wall, and it's he's God, so it's a very powerful and excessive thing that he does. But by causing all of this destruction, but by actualizing a particular sequence of events, he's actually able to elicit unconscious knowledge from himself, and Sophia's in that role. But at the same time, God as the totality, God is the unconscious too, right? So it's not just that God is unconscious, it's God is the unconscious at the same time. And in that way, you can read a very Jungian quote unquote take on the book of Job would be, and Edinger makes this very explicit. It's definitely there in Answer to Job itself, but Edinger, is it Alfred? I'm having a mind blank on his first name, but he's a very kind of a notable Jungian theorist. That this whole thing is a depiction of Arthur Edinger. Anyway,
Arthur is what was coming to me too.
yeah, maybe it's Arthur. Yeah, of an encounter with the self. So in this case, we've got now Job, the human, who is himself coming to consciousness in a way through this encounter with his own unconscious, elements, which are personified or imaged in terms of God himself. And then that also becomes a big deal in his discussion of the revelation of St. John, and the coming to consciousness of things for John in this apocalyptic vision. But we'll get to that. But yeah, so again, there's these different ways you can read it, and I think it's quite important to see that yes, God is unconscious. This image of God is of an unconscious God, but also importantly, God is the unconscious, and then that can take us into discussion of the pleroma and of the individuation process, because again, this whole thing, God is undergoing individuation, but at the same time, we are individuating. Humans in this religious tradition, in fact, is individuating through the images of God that are being elicited from its unconscious. So it gets very knotty.
I mean, part of the issue here is, I think, Jung would want his anatomy of the psyche to in some sense correlate with the moral anatomy of the Bible. So Jung's attempt to map psychological dynamics in more or less the European psyche, he would expect and prefer actually for that to be mirrored in the history of Christian psychology, of the Christian experience, right?
Mhm.
And so this relationship between ego and unconscious, I mean, in the movement towards the self, when the ego, it's like the ego and the unconscious kind of, they create each other, not just through repression as Freud thought, but like as the ego comes to consciousness, its light is so bright and so focused, and intent and attentive to what's in front of it, that it totally forgets about the majority of existence, which is the darkness behind it. And that's the dynamic with Yahweh, who is like the ego of the divine, the ego of the soul of the world, let's say, the world soul. And this egoic conception of the divine, Jung says this is basically like, how these ancient peoples were imagining kings, and Whitehead makes this point too in his critique of monotheism, that God is just being imagined as a kind of dictator or a all powerful king who is the locus of all agency, and with everyone else being merely subject to or subjects of that all-seeing, all-powerful being. And so we, in overcoming the ego's attempt to overcome its unconsciousness and move towards the self, is a movement, I think, away from the idea of an unconscious towards a community of other kinds of consciousness, right? Like, I think once you understand the significance of the incarnation, it seems to me what Jung is saying is that there's a reconciliation of these opposites, and so you're no longer just an ego with an unconscious.
Mhm.
Through the this symbol of the incarnation, or the symbol of Christ, which becomes it's just the religious version of what he means psychologically by self. It's a way of reconciling these opposites that it seems to me it would leave us in a totally transfigured situation, both collectively and individually. And it's like Jung is diagnosing a problem with the Bible, but his prescription is still Christianity, I think.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, so Jung considers himself a Christian and obviously a Westerner, and so he says that he will, speak through or work through the tradition that he understands most deeply, and he does. I mean, he certainly, even borrows the term self with a capital S from, his understanding of the Purusha Atman, Upanishadic, Vedic, Indian doctrine, and he explicitly references that in Answer to Job and in many other places. And he does, like in this Psychology and Religion collected works, there's a whole section on Eastern religion, and he travels a lot. We talked about it last time. You brought it up, I think, in his quest to see the Westerner from non-Western eyes, and he believes that he's been able to do that to some extent. And he certainly studies Indian, in particular, religious traditions, and some a bit of Taoism as well. Obviously, the I Ching. So he does try to broaden his understanding of the human psyche in general. But he's very clear that as a Westerner, he has to work through these Western models because that is how his psyche is structured. And then he's very skeptical about Westerners going to the East and directly utilizing Eastern wisdom traditions as a way of sort of transcending their ego. So, he basically thinks that, the ego is such a developed function in the modern Westerner that any transcendence of the ego that one imagines one has achieved through, yoga, he would say, he uses yoga as a very generic term for all sorts of Eastern meditation practices, is actually risking a rendering of the ego unconscious, as just another autonomous complex inhabiting the psyche and animating the person without us being aware of it. And he thinks that that's a kind of inflation and very, very dangerous. So he's very concerned about that. So that's all just to speak to his affirmation of the Western Christian tradition. He's pretty clear that I think he's got tons of respect for other traditions, but he has to work with what he has. And he thinks that Westerners are obliged to do that. And actually, Peter Kingsley, who is one of my favorite, I don't know that he would consider himself a Jungian either, but he's written some wonderful stuff about Jung. He describes Jung's project. And there is a letter that Jung says this explicitly in, but as the attempt to create a Zen for the West. So he is trying to sort of rehabilitate a living wisdom tradition for the West, and he sees his analytical psychology as part of that project.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that underlying sense of mission that Jung had there might explain part of his animosity towards Rudolf Steiner, who was, a town over, trying to do that very thing with anthroposophy to create a living,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
experientially grounded and practically applicable form of, this Christian Western project. But this uh, struggle, let's talk about Yahweh and Satan
Yeah, okay.
and the way in which there's some ambiguity, and Jung notes this in footnotes between he mentions the Persian Ahriman,
Mhm.
and he also mentions Lucifer in the
Mm.
context of the mention of Ahriman. He's referring specifically there to the doubting thoughts that
Mhm.
must be being repressed in Yahweh, but that are represented by this prologue, before God starts torturing Job, where it's just God and Satan. Like this is this is an Ahrimanic influence, doubting, that this that Job and that the creation can respond appropriately to Yahweh. And then Lucifer becomes this more ambiguous figure, I think, because Lucifer is described in a more Promethean way, as if
Mhm.
having foresight and even more omniscience than Yahweh, and
Yeah.
even knowing before Yahweh that Christ would become necessary. And almost Lucifer plays this role of giving the human being knowledge or foresight of this fact, which is to say, by stealing fire from heaven in some sense. It's as though Yahweh forgets that man was created in the image and the
Mhm.
likeness of
Mhm.
God. And Lucifer reminds human beings of this fact. And so
Yeah.
there's a weird ambiguity of evil having this polar dimension to it, which, I mentioned Lucifer and Ahriman here, both because Jung does, but also because these are very important personifications of evil in anthroposophy as well.
Mhm.
And so it seems like whenever we do engage in a discussion of Satan, as most Christians think of him or it, it's important that we disambiguate that a little bit. And Jung helps us begin to do that. But
Yeah.
it's the whole question of the status of evil, not as a privation, but as a positive
Yeah.
aspect of the Godhead. And
Yeah.
so, who are these beings? I think is a question that Jung is sort of urgently asking, more or less explicitly, and that we come into a positive relationship with evil and not just look the other way and all constantly deny that that's in me, or that it could be in God, or and so it's quite a challenge, and it's like it is a kind of like taking up of the cross, which is to say, in the face of evil, the Buddhist or even the Greek sort of Aristotelian response would be, well, it's really just ignorance. And if we come to know ourselves and each other better, like there won't be any evil anymore in the world. Whereas the Christian would say, no, we can't just regress to the mythic circularity. We have to encounter and carry the cross, which is this, for Jung, becomes the reconciliation of opposites and
Mhm.
a kind of psychic truth that logic cannot account for or explain, but that it also can't ignore because it's sort of an empirical fact in the psyche.
Yeah, I mean, Jung is super clear all over the place about how dangerous he thinks it is for us to repress or ignore our shadows, right? So to imagine that they're not some sort of, yes, positive, as in constitutive, force within us. And this essay or whatever it is, Answer to Job, is absolutely replete with that. Um, like really, again, exhortation for us to pay attention to this and our obligation to become conscious. And he absolutely characterizes Yahweh's massive, sputtering, pride-filled overreaction, chest puffing, earth shaking, etc., as the consequence of a long-term sort of repression. So when he's speaking in a more psychological or like psychoanalyzing God sort of register, as the consequence of a long-term repression of the shadow. And again, that he very vividly, it's very interesting, the two different halves of this essay that we're going to be talking about, because it's a big part of his interpretation of the revelation as well. So there's that.
Mm-hmm.
But he's also therefore very clear about the importance of doubt, right? So he also justifies essentially his own not only right or whatever, but obligation to question. So, and that's also a directly aimed at the theologians who would criticize him or anyone for questioning, divine revelation or dogma or he says, no, we have this obligation to doubt and to question.
Yeah,
And
to accept traditional theodicy, in other words, is to forfeit our capacity for and desire and need for intellectual coherence, because it literally doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and also to give up on our ongoing individuation process as a collective and as individuals, which he's obviously deeply committed to, and he thinks that would be a barrier to us taking responsibility for the power that we have, because, by the way, and we haven't talked about this, because of the indwelling of the Holy Ghost, the ongoing incarnation, and to connect to our conversation about processes of actualization and individuation in the Simondonian sense, this indwelling of the Holy Ghost, or this continued incarnation after Christ, and so the sending of the Paraclete, right? This is us as humans for Jung, but as organisms carrying within us the pre-individual milieu, so to speak, or indeed the pleroma. But we have this source within us which perturbs and causes us to doubt, but that is the seeds of creativity, and we have to take responsibility for our capacity so we basically have to become intelligent designers of culture, he's saying. But we are these creative beings, we are animated in this way, and if we don't take a kind of conscious responsibility for things can go terribly wrong, and we might end up like this unconscious God, doing so much destruction.
I think the civilizational warning that's present in so much of Jung's work is in this text too, not just as a subtext, but predominantly, he's focusing on this Job's psychological situation and what it means for the nature of God, but and what the meaning of the incarnation. But just struggling with the historical situation of nuclear weapons being invented, and just having witnessed the Second World War and the First, and having premonitions of the First. Jung was very much aware of the urgency of allowing us to find human wisdom, just in the same way that Yahweh desperately needed to find wisdom, that we've lost our capacity for actual foresight, and we've allowed this, we've become so obsessed with our own creation, just as Yahweh became so obsessed with his own creation and power to manipulate matter, that we've forgotten, our whole purpose for creating in the first place.
And we've forgotten that we're responsible for those things that we've created, and that we actually, to the extent that we become conscious, are capable of exercising a continued sort of control over those creations. We can't just let them out into the world and say, oh, well, the genie's out of the box, or, Pandora's box is open, there's nothing we can do about it now. It's like, no, we let this out into the world. We created this. It's our job as stewards. So that is a sort of a Christian idea, but there's, I think the Jungian twist on it is very different, or very particular. We are stewards of our power of creation, of creativity. It confers a responsibility on us, and we have to become conscious of, we have to become conscious of the consequences of unconsciousness, essentially, in this in this sense. He also says, just on the constitutive and generative nature of doubt, he says, ex perfecto nihil fit, right? From perfection comes nothing, say the old masters, whereas the imperfectum carries within it the seeds of its own improvement, right? So there's this, again, there's this perturbative function of the imperfect. So actually, that's the feminine again, right? That's, but it's also oh, maybe it's a bridge too far to make that connection right now, but it's speaking again to the perturbative function of having this completeness but imperfection within us. And that complete, so the pleroma is complete, it is replete, everything is there, but it is not perfect, and things are not there in these very discrete, determinate, quote unquote, perfected or individuated forms, but it is the generative power, the creative force that is within us, and it is, you know, generative of course, you know, beautiful things and benevolent things, but also it's the source of this doubt that he speaks of. It's the source of the kind of noise that continues to perturb any sense of perfection. You know, one of the things that I wanted to mention as a kind of constant refrain through this work, and it's quite funny, but he's very impish when he talks about omniscience, and he just says it over and over and over again. You know, he you know, if God had only consulted his omniscience, you know, none of this would have had to happen. You know, and clearly God already knew about all this, but, you know, like he makes fun of the notion of omniscience a lot. And really, again, there I see a warning against the kind of lure or the appeal of the idea of perfection or of final understanding or of dogma, basically. You know, Jung is exhorting us to be critical, to embrace doubt on a certain level, and to understand that, you know, omniscience, it just, well, not only is it not a possibility for limited beings such as we, but even God cannot consult his own omniscience. And that's because, again, in the omniscience of completeness, which is like another thing that he does a lot in this work, which makes it really rich but difficult to disentangle, is that there's a lot of internal analogies, right? So there's omniscience, which is also analogized to the pleroma again, in a sense that in the pleroma, things are there for eternity, everything is there, right? It's also analogized to the completeness of the feminine. But omniscience, God, who is supposedly omniscient, and, you know, Jung doesn't explicitly say God is not omniscient, because that would be a kind of naive literalism, but he cannot consult his own omniscience, because in omniscience, in completeness, in the pleromatic form, things are not in fact individuated. Things are not determinate there. So they cannot be objects of sort of propositional knowledge. It is more that there is this pluripotent potential that's indefinite, so you cannot have definite knowledge about it there. And that's why, again, God needs to act in order to elicit a response from the world, but also therefore from his unconscious, so that he can actually, things are individuated. And again, this is another analogy for the incarnation. Incarnation is individuation. Things are elicited through this process of actualization, and it's kind of an improvisatory thing. Like in acting in the world, he cannot consult his omniscience to know in advance what the consequences of that action would be. Just like the rest of us, he has to act and then see what the consequences are, but then be open to, you know, an increase in consciousness, an increase in awareness, and an increase in knowledge, but only through this feedback between, you know,
Yeah.
the world and his supposedly omniscient pre-knowledge.
I couldn't help but feel the resonance in Hegel's master-slave dialectic in that particular, you know, account of Yahweh needing man's consciousness or an object in order to exist himself or convince himself that he exists. Because, you know, despite Jung's dismissals and criticisms of Hegel's philosophy, not just criticisms, but like it was like he considers it a disaster basically for philosophy, and that we need to go back to Kant. But this master-slave dialectic, as Hegel describes it in the Phenomenology of Spirit, is very much like how Jung is describing God's encounter, Yahweh's encounter with Job, and the way in which the slave in this context, or the creature who has been mastered or is mastered by God, ends up becoming more conscious, in particular a kind of moral consciousness, in Hegel's narrative. And it's just, the structure of these dialectics they're identical, I think, more or less. And so there is a Hegelian reading of Jung, I think, that would be worthwhile to do here, despite the way they're often read as just intellectually incompatible with one another.
Yeah. So I'd love to read that quote from On the Nature of the Psyche about Hegel. But to say, there is a Hegelian reading of Jung for sure. I mean, Wolfgang Gigerich, who is one of the most influential Jungian theorists of today, he basically thinks that Hegel is Jung's philosopher, and that Jung misses a trick by not embracing him in this way. But Jung is super clear about why. It's not like Jung didn't know Hegel, and it's not like he didn't even recognize, I think, that's more like reading between the lines, the resonance between some of their ideas. But I think he's super clear about what the danger, like Hegel's danger or whatever, is. So I'll just read this quote, if that's okay. It's kind of taking it out of answer to Job for a second, but the victory of Hegel over Kant dealt the gravest blow to reason and to the further development of the German and ultimately of the European mind. All the more dangerous as Hegel was a psychologist in disguise who projected great truths out of the subjective sphere into a cosmos he himself had created. We know how far Hegel's influence extends today. And then he talks about a compensation in later Schelling, in Schopenhauer, in Carus, which is people he identifies as part of his lineage, moving towards analytical psychology, which is, by the way, when people say that Jung didn't know Schelling, also wrong. What does he say? Let me get to this point. So yeah, whatever the spirit of God is extruded from our human calculations, an unconscious substitute takes its place. In Schopenhauer, we find the unconscious will as the new definition of God. In Carus, the unconscious, and in Hegel, identification and inflation, the practical equation of a philosophical reason with spirit, thus making possible the intellectual juggling with the object, which achieves such a horrid brilliance in his philosophy of the state. He basically says Hegel offered a solution of the problem raised by epistemological criticism in that he gave ideas a chance to prove their unknown power of autonomy. So instead of mediating them, as autonomous ideas, which we mediate in the bringing to consciousness of them in this sort of individuation process. He's basically saying Hegel gives untrammeled, allows them to just run wild, so to speak. They induced that hybris of reason, which led to Nietzsche's Superman, and hence to the catastrophe that bears the name of Germany. I think it's obvious that all philosophical statements which transgress the bounds of reason are anthropomorphic and have no validity beyond that which falls to psychically conditioned statements. And here's the funny, it's harsh. A philosophy like Hegel's is a self-revelation of the psychic background and philosophically a presumption. Psychologically, it amounts to an invasion by the unconscious. So again, Hegel is possessed. The peculiar high-flown language that Hegel uses bears out this view. It is reminiscent of the megalomaniac language of schizophrenics who use terrific spellbinding words to reduce the transcendent to subjective form, to give banalities the charm of novelty, or pass off commonplaces as searching wisdom. So bombastic a terminology is a symptom of weakness, ineptitude, and lack of substance. Now, I think he goes a long way there and gets pretty colorful at the end. And I personally think that he does elsewhere in his history of modern psychology, which is a series of lectures. He elsewhere says that Hegel is a philosopher manqué, so is a psychologist manqué, is a psychologist in disguise, whereas I, Jung, am a philosopher manqué. So he actually they're meeting each other in the middle, in a certain sense. But I think he feels like if he didn't have these various epistemological strictures and he wasn't making a certain kind of boundary, even though he's in this liminal zone and he's using archetypes and those sorts of things as these border concepts. And in answer to Job, he identifies the concept of God and the concepts of archetypes as border concepts. Even though he's working in that liminal zone, he really thinks, and we talked about this last time, obviously, in terms of the ethic of the encounter and the actual psychiatric, psychotherapeutic situation, which his thought was, forged in. He really thinks that if he didn't have that Kantian, at least in the philosophical epistemological register, set of strictures, that he might himself have been a Hegel. So I think he recognizes that there's a lot of similarity, but he says, pass off commonplaces as great novelty or whatever. Jung is saying these ideas, so to the extent that Hegel and Jung's thought is similar, Jung would say that that's our archetypal inheritance, or we're getting that from the Christian tradition, or whatever. And I, Jung, am exploring that structure, whereas Hegel is reifying and hypothesizing it, and even kind of claiming it as his own.
What's interesting, I was doing a little research before this to see what prior theological responses were to the Book of Job.
Oh, yeah.
And, Origen in the 3rd century, I think, is already saying that Job is a kind of prefiguration of the incarnation, because it like makes this new kind of morality a necessity that God was clearly not yet displaying. And so, yeah, there's a long history here of interpretation. And so a lot of the things Jung is doing, I think the methodology is very novel, but the theological moves are maybe not as novel. The Gnostics, the whole Hermetic tradition, Kabbalah. I mean, there's alchemy, etc. Astrology. He drops the Saturn, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Pisces thing, and referencing his prior book Aeon about the age of Pisces and the age of Aquarius and all of this. So he's drawing on the whole Western esoteric tradition here to talk about Yahweh as not actually being the whole story, right? And that's why the Old Testament is the New Testament. But again, that's a very, it's an attempt to overcome one exclusivist project, which would be the God of the Old Testament and the people of the Old Testament, with a new kind of exclusivism, a universalist, which is inclusive on some level, but also like this is the only way to be universal. It's kind of what the New Testament message is.
Yeah.
And Jung is, despite his I don't want to say psychologization, no, scratch that, but despite his psychoanalysis of the Bible and its reception, I think he still ultimately does see this as a kind of psychic necessity for Westerners, that you will go through this process.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that that's right. And I think that is where he trends into a kind of almost essentialism. He would again justify that as just saying the Western psyche has been formed by this tradition, and thus, the canal that's canalizing our individuation processes is set by this. And so we therefore have a responsibility to grapple with it in this way. But no, I think that you're absolutely right. And again, you find that in his warnings about, even his warnings about psychedelics maybe, but certainly his warnings about going to the East and seeking these alternative. And I actually think he's quite prophetic there. And I would probably sharply disambiguate. I think there are lots of things that we would want to disambiguate there. And I think, Westerners who go to the East and who really devote themselves to a, Buddhist practice or whatever it might be, are quite different from people who adopt the practice but don't understand or actually care to understand the underlying philosophy. So people who say, yogis can have Prada, but who don't understand and who are obviously getting something out of yoga and that's great, but haven't really engaged with the renunciatory aspect of the philosophy, for example. And of course, we see though this toxic guruism is a big issue in India as well. It's not just Westerners who imbibe a little bit of this stuff and then render their capacity to self-reflect egoically and the necessary role of the ego in that self-reflection, and they render that function unconscious, and then they undergo this massive inflationary identification, and they end up doing all sorts of horrible things to their to their acolytes and things. This is a major phenomenon in India as well. So it's not just Westerners that do that, but that's what he's concerned about, and he's concerned about a superficial philosophy of transcending the self, the ego, that is actually only going to hide a narcissistic inflation. And to be honest, that's prophetic, because I think we see a lot of that in the world, in the psychedelic community as well as in other communities.
Yeah, and just to, also show another way that Jung is Hegelian, and not to say that he's just influenced by Hegel here, but that they both have the same insight into history, that, Jung would acknowledge, just as Plato acknowledged, that a lot of the wisdom available that came through Pythagoreanism, and that, like, was already understood, by the time Thales and the other guys started philosophizing around the Mediterranean, that Asia and Africa were the more ancient sources for a lot of these ideas and practices. And I think, Jung points to Egypt, ancient Egyptian myth, as another source of prefiguration of, in Osiris and Isis and these myths and Set, that there's a prefiguration of the idea of the divine son, and that Christianity is not somehow unique, and that clearly, the Christ archetype has these prefigurations, but that there is also something unprecedented about what's occurring in the Christ myth slash, he says it's a plurimatic eternal event, but it also is a historical moment, right?
That's his theory of individuation. So it's archetypal, which means, of course, it's been prefigured all over the place, but it's also unique. It's contingent. It's highly specific. And he is saying this particular specific history is, appropriate to the modern Western psyche. It has to be grappled with by the modern Western psyche, collectively and individually, simply because it is our history, and we're born of that. But it's a contingent, particular manifestation of a pattern which is generic, and that's what an archetype is. And not because, again, he's very clear, and I think there's a footnote in answer to Job. Actually, maybe it was in one of the things I was reading from Practice of Psychotherapy in the last week. But he's very clear, actually, all over the place, that we shouldn't think of archetypes in terms of inherited ideas. So when he's talking about the specific God image and the incarnation and everything as manifest within the Christian tradition, he's obviously talking about very specific ideas. They are not themselves archetypes. They are not themselves, they are archetypal in an adjectival sense, but they are not the archetypes. Archetypes are patterns of behavior, in fact. They're not ideas at all, he says. Right? Well, they should be likened more to patterns of behavior. And that's why, as we discussed last time, he was very fond of this idea of the yucca moth, a particular encounter in the world eliciting a particular pattern of behavior from the moth. And that's, again, a little bit like, yes, everything's there in the pleroma, but a certain thing in the external world, and I have got a quote somewhere for this. A certain thing in the external world has to elicit. Where is it?
Yeah, like a catalyst.
That's a hang on. Paragraph 640. As always, when an external event touches on some unconscious knowledge, this knowledge can reach consciousness. Again, that's his vision. That's his view. His psychological interpretation or presentation of this generic process of individuation in the psychological register. But again, remember, Simondon borrows that term over for a process of actualization. And I do think it's very analogous to the Whiteheadian process of actualization that we've been talking about elsewhere. But something that is already actual, so something that's out in the world, elicits a response. And so Jung will, and where he's at his most essentializing and perennialist, let's say, because you've brought that up, he will talk about, becoming what you already are, and, you already have all of this knowledge. The knowledge is there in sort of pleromatic form, let's say, in this indefinite form. But, well, that's what one has to keep emphasizing is that whatever he's talking about in terms of eliciting unconscious knowledge is not definite, is not really propositional knowledge until it is actually elicited by something in the actual. And that we can quite easily map onto a process of an image of the canalization of a pluripotent potential by the actual, because it's requiring this feedback, this relational coming into conformity for something specific, something determinate to take its therefore contingent shape. And so that's how I would say, yeah, that's the relationship between the Christian images and the Christian myth. And this is what also what makes myth more than fiction. Now, I don't want to denigrate fiction at all. Because maybe there's more of the mythic in most fiction than making these things completely separate would indicate. But here he wants to say fiction would be something like, you just made up, you just had this idle fantasy and it was fun and it was entertaining and you wrote it down and you created a piece of fiction or whatever. Whereas myth resonates with facts. Myth contains facts or deep truths. They take a specific determinate form, a set of images in a particular mythological tradition or in a particular myth, but the reason they have such power over us and the reason that they're true in this sense and not merely fiction for Jung is because they're resonating with those perennial quote unquote eternal patterns, which are the tensions or they are the topology, the topos in the pleroma, but they are not definite.
Do you remember, I didn't write the page number down, but at some point Jung talks about how even creation from nothing, a creatio ex nihilo, still must draw upon the ideas in the mind of God, right, that are there. And so there's a little bit of a sense of, yeah, there more. I mean, is topos enough to capture the idea of these ideas pre-existing a creation even from nothing? I mean, and nothing usually, usually always is an ambiguous term. Is that just matter, like this substance lacking form, or is nothing really an absence of any characteristic? Is it chaos, or are these ideas even different? I mean, what is the nothing, and why are these ideas said to pre-exist the nothing and be printed on the nothing?
It's a very deep and difficult question, obviously. So I think, find the quote that you're referring to, maybe. These intimations and prefigurations of the incarnation must strike one as either. So he talks about corresponding testimonies in ancient Egyptian. So it's very in keeping with what we've been listening at. Right. Intimations and prefigurations of the incarnation must strike one as either completely incomprehensible or superfluous, since all creation ex nihilo is God's and consists of nothing but God. He's actually, again, implicitly problematizing the idea of the ex nihilo creation, obviously. Consists of God and nothing but God, with the result that man, like the rest of creation, is simply God become concrete. So God is everything in this view, right? Prefigurations, however, are not in themselves creative events, but are only stages in the process of becoming conscious. So the way I'm going to see this, and remind me or poke me to return to what is the nothing or something like that. But I'm seeing this very much in terms of this graded ontology. And, we talked about it in terms of the model that like Michael Epperson gives of quantum mechanics and how he likens it to the process of actualization in Whitehead. But, you go from this field of potential where principle of non-contradiction, principle of excluded middle, et cetera, don't hold. And then you enter into, as you come closer to a particular actualization, but therefore moving into proximal connection with what has already been actualized, you get into this probabilistic landscape. And then eventually you coalesce on this discrete determinate thing. And I think that, that's what Jung is kind of getting at.
A few pages later was the mention of the ex nihilo I was thinking of, actually. It's 641.
Oh, yeah, I've got it here too. Yeah, you read it then.
Oh, he just says, as nothing can happen without a pre-existing pattern, not even creation ex nihilo, which must always resort to the treasure house of eternal images in the fabulous mind of the master workman, which he identifies as Sophia earlier. The choice of a model for the son who is now about to be begotten lies between Adam and yeah, and Abel and so on. But yeah, that reference to the treasure house of eternal images, I thought was somewhat problematizing the idea of a pluripotent continuum. You know, like he does seem to be, but maybe he's mocking the idea here. I mean, that could, but he's not talking about Yahweh as the master workman. So I'm kind of not sure where to put that statement.
Well, okay, so I read something into Jung which is not like explicitly there in Jung, right? Maybe we could say, okay. Jung is very ambiguous, and he, as we discussed last time, almost intentionally so. And he wants to say, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not systematizing this. And he will borrow freely from different, kinds of imagery and mash them up to some degree. And it's up to us as this is what I believe that he would intend. Yes, there's a lot of contradictory stuff in an essay like this, and he would intend for the reader to undergo their own process of individuation.
He's literally talking about the coincidentia positorum, so contradiction is going to be laced throughout everything. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah, and that's right at the core of his ideas, right? And that's what elicits from the reader here their own process of individuation, in which they have to grapple with these ideas in their own way. And Jung doesn't want to impose on us a specific interpretation, but there's a whole bunch of stuff in this section which is related, right? So, although the birth of Christ is an event, this is 629. That occurred but once in history, it has always existed in eternity. For the layman in these matters, the identity of a non-temporal eternal event with a unique historical occurrence is something that is extremely difficult to conceive. He must, however, accustom himself to the idea that time is a relative concept and needs to be comprehended by that of the simultaneous existence in the bardo, he's borrowing his Tibetan concept, or pleroma of all historical processes. What exists in the pleroma as an eternal process appears in time as an aperiodic sequence, that is to say, is repeated many times in an irregular pattern. So blah, 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 blah. So when these things occur as modern variants, they should not be regarded as personal episodes, because they're resonating with this universal pattern or chance idiosyncrasies, but as fragments of the pleromatic process itself, which, broken up into individual events occurring in time, is an essential component or aspect of the divine drama. So the breaking up of them into individual events in time, that's the individuation process, right? And as fragments, they're not pleromatic, so they're not complete, but they are determinate. They have a specific form. And I obviously take him saying they exist in the pleroma as an eternal process to mean, again, that there's nothing in the pleroma that is definite. There's nothing that's static, having a it's a processual view. And then the one that you pulled out is nothing can happen without a pre-existing pattern. So what's the nature of this pattern? Well, again, he talks about pattern memories and behavioral things as opposed to specific images, often when he talks about archetypes. And a pattern memory or a behavior that's elicited is not, again, it's not highly specific. It's not deterministic in the sense that, there's only one way this could go. It's like a constraint on behavior, but there may be many different ways. And again, this is just in keeping with his notion of the individuation process. There are these deep constraints, but there are many, many ways of being in conformity with them, with not violating them, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, just that I think that because he's, as you mentioned, likening it to, he's talked about eternal images in the fabulous mind of the master workman, which is Sophia. Sophia is complete. She's the feminine ideal of completeness, but not perfection. And I think, again, that perfection here is analogous to, or is a way of speaking about determinacy, staticity, the static arrangement of something. And there's none of that in Sophia. So it's more indefinite, more indeterminate. And I think it fits with, Whitehead's just basic idea that potential is continuous, the actual is atomic. I think we're seeing another articulation of that. But it's tortuous to pull these things apart, for sure.
Yeah, I mean the connection between the perfect and the complete in the trying to understand the archetypes or the eternal objects as determinate in advance of actualization or just pluripotent and continuous is, I mean, that's the right connection to make. Because in Whitehead, even though, we've discussed in other videos how he waffles between saying that eternal objects are definite
Yeah.
just as pure potentials
Mhm.
prior to any specific actualization, and he will say they're continuous. And I think when he says they're continuous, he just means because of they have relational essences, and so they're infinitely internally related one to the other, and so independent of actualization, it's very difficult to understand them as definite. But I think in a similar way, when Jung makes reference in a mystical religious context to the Kabbalah and the Sephiroth and the shards that are like the retarded sort of backward projection of the vessels, the shards, and Jung refers to this. I think there's something that prefigures the creation of the physical world, but it's not perfect, right? And so, I mean, let me just read Jung's footnote on this. He's just finished saying that this new factor has entered into the world situation, the unheard of fact that, without knowing it or wanting it, a mortal man is raised by his moral behavior above the stars in heaven, from which position of advantage he can behold the back of Yahweh, the abysmal world of the, quote, shards. And the footnote is this is an allusion to the idea found in the later Kabbalistic philosophy. These shards, also called shells, or in Hebrew kelepot, form 10 counterpoles to the 10 Sephiroth, which are the 10 stages in the revelation of God's creative power. The shards, representing the forces of evil and darkness, were originally mixed with the light of the Sephiroth. The Zohar describes evil as the byproduct of the life processes of the Sephiroth. Therefore, the Sephiroth had to be cleansed of the evil admixture of the shards. The elimination of the shards took place in what is described in the Kabbalistic writings, particularly of Isaac Luria and his school, as the breaking of the vessels. Through this, the powers of evil assumed a separate and real existence. So there's this whole drama in heaven which unfolds as an eternal process where there is some degree of differentiation, even between good and evil, as well as between the 10 different vessels and then their counterpoles, the shards. But they lack perfection and incompleteness. There's a rescue mission that's needed here. And it has something to do with actualization, individuation, something which can only be accomplished in history and in a contingent particular way.
Yeah. But also, yes, I mean, the images are, so one of the things you ask is, what is the nothing? Well, it's ineffable, right? So it's the unpre-thinged, it's the pre-individual, it's all of that. But there are images, and all of these, mythic attempts to grapple with the nature of creation, with the nature of actualization, are differentiated images because they are the created, the actualized beings trying to depict this process, which is, of course, and this is just how Jung would see it, and I mean, he's very clear about this, which is in itself not depictable. And a couple of really quick quotes again. Another one's paragraph 620, where he first mentions the Bardo state. In the pleromatic, or as the Tibetans call it, Bardo state, there is a perfect interplay of cosmic forces. So there is some, degree of differentiation, but with the creation, that is, with the division of the world into distinct processes in space and time, events began to rub and jostle one another. And then a little bit further down, he says, this is where he talks about Satan actually meriting the name Lucifer, but the peculiar unforeseen antics of men arouse Yahweh's wrath and thereby involve him in his creation. So they're unprestatable, they're unforeseen. So even in his omniscience, so to use the Kaufman term, they can't be pre-stated. And that coming directly after, like a few lines after, with the creation, with the division of the world into distinct processes, events begin to rub and jostle one another. He's talking about a progressive differentiation. So there might be like currents or something in the pleroma or the bardo state, but they don't become really genuinely distinct processes until creation, until actualization. And that's what makes also things unprestatable, because to the extent that things continually draw on, these basically undifferentiated tensions, or currents, or whatever, gradients, etc., they are unpredictable, because they can incorporate those tensions in any vast number of different ways, and that's why Yahweh has to become involved in his creation. So he has to enter into this dialogue with the creation, because that's the only place he can get anything determinate. So if he wants to get, it's like if he wants to get better at predicting, he will never, things will never become fully prestatable, but he has to be very engaged with the actual process of creation itself, which is the source of determinacy, I would say. That's how I prefer to read it. Like it's not. I'm not saying that that's the only way of reading it, but yeah.
I mean, elsewhere Jung talks about the Trinity. Is it in? I haven't finished. I haven't read this in 15 years and haven't read the second half. Does he talk about the Trinity in this book?
He does, yes, yeah.
And the instability of three and the need for the fourth. That's later in this book, or no?
Does he talk about the need for the fourth in this book? He's got that in a bunch of places. So he's got the
Yeah, because matter, evil, Mary, Sophia, like they all get associated with the fourth that completes the instability of the Trinity. And whether he talks about it here or not, I mean,
but here he's actually more identifying Sophia with the Holy Spirit, I would say, even though that's implicit. I'd say that there again, it's because there are all these sort of nested analogies in a certain sense, and definitely she gets strongly analogized. She's God's breath. She's the Logos as well. So so she's also the Son. I mean, they're all. He has a relational image of the Trinity here, where they're all interpenetrating each other to some extent. But I think Sophia is more like part of that here. He has another essay, The Problem of the Fourth, and he also has the psychological interpretation of the Trinity, or whatever, which is also in this Burke's book.
But I mean, the idea that I was reaching for here is that there's a kind of historical evolution through an orientation primarily towards the Father, Yahweh, then the Son as this unique embodiment of the God-man, to the Spirit, which is the realization, as Jung reiterates a few times, that Jesus is always saying, "Is it not written that ye are sons of and daughters of God?" Or that this potentiality to individuate is actually distributed amongst the human community. I'm not the special one, and that's the Spirit that's left after Jesus Christ is crucified and dies. And so there's this need to progress through that as a process of self-development, psychological development, where if the Old Testament is this book of the Father, and the New Testament, the Gospels, I should say, is the book of the Son, then the attempt to move in, with Paul and the apostles and the Revelation, like there's an attempt to speak to this absence of the Son in some sense, and a new responsibility to become attentive and responsive to the Spirit, which is a whole new form of responsibility.
But God can't intervene directly. God's not going to set things right. God attempted to intervene through the incarnation, and also we can talk about why that fails to be complete. I mean, you mentioned, Mary and her being too perfect, because she is not, she hasn't partaken in original sin, and also, so that makes Jesus slightly more on the divine side than on the human side, and he kind of implies that Jesus never, had relations with a woman as well, so he never becomes complete. And that's one of the reasons why the incarnation is not a complete salvation, so to speak. That's why it's up to us. God can't intervene directly, but God has, through the indwelling of the Paraclete, through the indwelling of the Holy Ghost, has given us the power and thus the responsibility to be the stewards, or whatever, to intelligently shepherd the biosphere etc. I think of course, I prefer to read this also as nothing new, in the sense that it's not that, because Jung does talk a number of times about this dramatic change in the status of man, because of the coming of the Paraclete, and I think it's more like, reading in a psychological register, it's the coming to consciousness that is required. So we've always been, of course, I'm going to see it this way, right? We've always been these creative beings. We've always had that pre-individual, source of all creativity and generativity and everything within us, as do all organisms, as does the whole cosmos in different ways, right? But this is an image or a myth, a story, but not in a pejorative sense, about the coming to consciousness of that creative principle, and that because of the specific way that the human psyche, and of course, yes, there is a possible exceptionalism here in terms of the Christian psyche, because of the particular differentiation of the psyche, we are now in a position to recognize that responsibility, which we've always had.
Yeah, it's certainly retroactive. I mean, that's a whole theological problem, is like, for early Christian thinkers, is, Plato and Aristotle seem to get some of this
Yeah.
transcendent God stuff, but how are they in hell, or what? They didn't know about Christ. And so, yeah, it's retroactive in this way that can be explained, if you just utilize the idea of heaven and hell, and that Christ, goes down there and saves some people, after the incarnation, changes the nature of man. It doesn't just change the nature of living man, it changes the nature of death too. And I think, yeah, it's, thinking about this as an evolution of consciousness, I think, I feel like it's important for us to put that in a more pluralistic,
Yeah.
post-colonial context, where clearly, it's not just that people haven't heard about Christianity, it's that they have and they don't want any. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And so, and on the other hand, most Christians alive today are not white or European, right? And so, in terms of the role of the Christian mythos today, it's actually not in the hands of Europe anymore, if it ever was. I mean, it's the Palestinian Jew who, first brought this religion into being, in some sense, who's not European. And so, whether it's a European religion or not is a bigger question. And what even is the West these days? I mean, you've got plenty of post-colonial theorists suggesting that that's a modern construct and never, really
Yeah.
existed as something independent from Africa and Asia. It's
Yeah, and I think even though Jung is, of course, quick to speak about the West, he would recognize all of those. He would recognize that problematization of the West, in terms of its historical connectedness and inheritance, and he is talking about that. And he does. I can't find this thing somewhere. He specifically talks about the Christian reaction to Dionysus, as in terms of recognizing it as a myth of the young dying god, and having to say that that there is this retroactivity, or eternal nature of these sorts of things. And elsewhere, Jung would certainly identify Buddha and Muhammad and others as archetypal resonances of this sort of incarnational story. It's just, again, that he is himself, I mean, having been raised by a pastor, and identifying as a Christian in his own obviously unique way. He's just grappling with his tradition most directly, and he feels like his main audience are people who are grappling with that tradition.
But he also says that Jung says Christ cannot be demythologized, and that he cannot be compared to Pythagoras, Muhammad, and Buddha. Like, he specifically says that's
Yeah,
going to
well,
block an understanding of the psychological process he's describing.
I think that that's definitely something that he says, and I think that he's problematizing the way that modern secularists would similarly demythologize all of those figures. And so he's
Right.
speaking
Sure.
to the Christian, he's speaking to the Christian in a sense, and saying that if we demythologized Christ, he would just be like a Buddha and a Muhammad from your Christian perspective.
Right.
But
Right.
I
Right.
don't I don't think that's inconsistent with him also being willing to affirm that they are, manifestations of the same sort of archetypal. I mean, he also talks about, again, I don't have the specific quote for it, but this this is a generic process in the differentiation of consciousness that's going on at this time, which, he doesn't borrow from Karl Jaspers and the axial age kind of notion, but he's very much in the tradition of thinking that kind of thought, that in this period between 600 BC and the birth of Christ, is this period of rapid sort of psychic evolution for humans in general.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, so I think we need to move towards wrapping up here. I wanna highlight what you've been bringing up about doubt, and I think that's relevant within Christendom, and there are various forms of atheism in the name of God, and as I think Alan Watts put it that way, and just death of God theologies, and Zizek's appropriation, Hegelian appropriation of Christianity. There are ways in which you can be a Christian atheist, and that doubt can function internally in a very productive way. But there are also ways in which you could just be, doubtful of Christianity as such and exist outside of that whole psychological paradigm, lineage, process, and have a different Hindu process for individuation, right? But I also think doubt. There's a form of doubt that is productive, but also a form of doubt that can become like skepticism for the sake of skepticism,
yeah, definitely.
which isn't productive or generative, and in fact is self-undermining and um, nihilistic, right? And I don't hear you proposing that at all. I hear doubt as a way of avoiding, well, dogma, basically.
Mm.
But then, what is the proper movement out of doubt toward an affirmative consciousness of some kind? Is it faith or is it knowledge? And need they be opposed? And that's, I think, what the possibility of gnosis would suggest, that actually there's a mediating synthesis between faith and knowledge. It would be something like this intuitive insight that allows you to experience the coincidence of opposites. And it's, gnosis, I think, is yeah, like between faith and knowledge, and it requires of us a integrative move beyond the dichotomy between science and religion, or between faith and reason. And it's like a recovery of revelation, but not unconscious revelation that's seemingly coming to us from outside, but like we become capable of, through an active imagination, consciously mythologizing our experience, right? Instead of having the myths happen to us.
Yeah, and I would say, yeah, that's all beautiful. And I would say that we just don't have a choice, which is what you're implying at the end there. We are going to understand ourselves in a narrative manner, and we could discuss whether that's a predominantly Western way of viewing things or not. And it certainly manifests in different ways in different parts of the world, and that's a big subject, like the way. But narrative is pretty generic. Um, there are different narrative forms, but that people have myth, that have religious traditions which have these, mythical narratives embedded within them, is pretty generic. So I think we're going to understand ourselves as protagonists, as characters in stories, and just in the way that Dennett even would say, that the ego is the self is the center of narrative gravity. And of course, the real danger is that when we don't have a broader framework, like a broader mythological framework, maybe like a big shared narrative that is inclusive. And at certain points in history, that was just inclusive of all the members of the tribe or all the members of the denomination or whatever. But we want to broaden that, obviously. If we don't have that kind of narrative, which enables us to just have a shared framework for engaging with the other, and it can be pretty minimal, that narrative, but understanding our relationship to the rest of the world, then we risk continuing to do this narrativizing thing, which is again pretty generic. In fact, Michael Evan even thinks that all organisms do it, and I want to problematize the literalization of narrative there. But let's at least say that humans do it. That it's a function of language. It's a particular way of embedding ourselves in the world with language. We're going to do that. So it's important to ensure that our narratives are not solipsistic, so to speak. Even if we're not metaphysically solipsists, that we are not, that the whole, basically that it's not too strong the way in which our egos or ourselves are the center of narrative gravity, right? We need to have other centers of narrative gravity. And that's one thing that religious and the etymology of religion, binding together, or like yoga, yoking together. This is another kind of perennial idea that these things can bring us together.
Yeah, which is why it really is important to have a deep encounter with the religions and spiritual traditions of other continents and peoples, and to really respectfully and sincerely just make an attempt to understand and to see the world from that perspective, even if you're not going to convert, because at the end of the day, that kind of deep interreligious dialogue allows you to understand your own tradition so much more clearly than you otherwise would.
Yeah. And it's also important, though, not to convert without understanding the tradition that one is converting to. So, just an aside, maybe. There's something else in what you said that I wanted to respond to, but I've lost it. But there's a couple of other things I want to bring up really quickly, and there might be things we can delve into more next time. One of the things is Jung says in a few places that consciousness requires. It's a bit of a Nietzschean point to some degree, but consciousness, in order for us to be conscious, we need to be threatened in some way. We need to be challenged in some way. And so basically God, as this like omniscient or omnipotent, rather is the appropriate omni here, being, can't be conscious because nothing threatens such a being. So God has to come into contact with death in order to become conscious. And really he gives us, and I think this is something that Zizek also talks about, since you brought him up, but God really only becomes consciousness through the incarnation at the moment when he doubts, at the moment when he's on the cross and he says, Father, Father, why have you forsaken me? That's actually the real coming to consciousness. The culmination of the incarnation is at that point where he becomes conscious of his own death, and therefore he doubts the benevolence of God. So, and this is a very, very different kind of doubt from the nihilistic skepticism that you're talking about, which would just dismiss the relevance of this, image altogether. And then the other thing, and that might be something we can delve into more next time, like it's almost a discussion about the function of consciousness, really, right? And its relation to vigilance and that sort of stuff. But I also wanted to mention, just in connection with we've talked about the Trinity, we've talked about the conjunctio has come up, and then the likening, the analogy or the similarity between Hegel and Jung. And so, people are very divided on Hegel and how you should think about the Hegelian dialectic, right? And there are a lot of Hegelians, especially those who are psychoanalytically informed, sort of Freudo-Hegelians or Lacanian Hegelians like Zizek, and his many, he's a hugely influential figure, obviously, who would problematize Hegel as a thinker of synthesis. And Wolfgang Gigerik would do this too. And he would say that one of the reasons why Jung is dismissive of Hegel is because he has the wrong understanding of the dialectic as thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And this is this problematic simplification, right? Because it implies an end to the process in some sense, that the things have been synthesized, that the difference has been pacified, and that the conjunctio, the coming together of these apparently opposites, doesn't contain within itself its own, new pregnant set of tension. So it's not a fundamentally creative process in some sense. And Jung can be problematic in when he talks about wholeness and all of that. We did talk about this last time, and I suggested that we think about it in terms of a kind of ideal, but not something that can be achieved. But Jung does get into, and I'm not sure if it's in this first 10 sections that we're supposed to be talking about today. So this might be something else. It's just a prelude for next time. But he talks a little bit about, I don't think he names it directly, but what he would come to call, or does call in other contexts, the transcendent function, which is basically to do with, again, it's a kind of a microcosm of an individuation process where there's a tension, a conflict between two terms, and then an irrational, unprestatable solution that spontaneously emerges. And it's not the thesis synthesis antithesis synthesis model of a dialectic, because it's not a synthesis. The hidden third, so to speak, is a relational term that mediates the tension between the two other terms, but is something that's genuinely new, that is formed in that relation. And of course, like I said, it can never be a final solution or any of that sort of thing. But there's an importance here in the sense that it's unprestatable and
Sounds like concrescence. The many become one and are increased by one. There's like a new thing produced.
Absolutely. It's a lot like concrescence, and it's the kind of thing that that Deleuze would want to see. We talked about this, I can't remember when we talked about this, maybe last time, but as non-evolutionary in a certain sense. There's a kind of leap there, right? Because it's irrational. So like evolution, in one way of seeing it, is a reasoning, a process of reason where one thing leads to another, and you can reverse engineer an evolutionary process. Whereas this coming into being of novelty is a saltatory process. It's a leap. So we can liken it to abduction in Peirce as well. And in these various evolutionary thinkers, this little kernel which problematizes at least a naive understanding of evolution in terms of gradualism. Like if you identify evolution with only gradualism and in the Dennett sense, but nature, he likes to refer to nature non facet saltatio. Nature doesn't admit leaps. Well, no, this is precisely the kind of leap that nature does admit, according to all of these different thinkers. I think you can find it in Jung, you can find it in Whitehead, you can find it in Peirce, and you can find it in, obviously, Deleuze, who emphasizes it maybe more explicitly than most of them do.
Yeah, and I would just say that this whole project that Jung's engaged in, not just in this book, but in all of his work, and so much of his work is just like Dennett, I think, an attempt to naturalize religion.
Yeah.
It's just that they have a very different sense, or method for doing so, where Dennett immediately turns to the brain and evolution, but Jung's also very evolutionary, but is not so quick to provide some kind of cranial explanation, but to recognize things like, I think Dennett was even skeptical of group selection, right?
Yeah.
And so, there's a sense in which the attempt to understand religious experience anthropologically and even biologically is itself not definitive as to whether there is any truth value in religion. I think Jung is finding a way to say religion can be true, whereas for Dennett and that more, I would say, the skeptical for the sake of skepticism approach to religious phenomena would be to say, no, religion is all false. And there might be this cynical sense that Dennett seems at least open to, that, well, maybe it was evolutionarily advantageous, and so the falsehood became this mimetic parasite that somehow did produce greater survival value for the communities that adopted those memes. But that's the mimetic reduction of religion and culture generally, I think, is a much more cynical approach to take to the naturalization of religion. And I don't think it leads civilization in a positive direction, especially as regards that question that we were discussing earlier with the relationship to technology. There's
Yeah.
no there's no ethical or moral wisdom in the idea of cultural evolution as a mimetic process, in the reductive sense that Dawkins and Dennett and mimetic evolutionary psychological types of explanations would see it. It would encourage us in that sense, if that were true, to continue our attempt to technologically master nature, to rebel against our selfish genes, as Dawkins did say.
Yeah, I mean, I think memetics is a great idea. I just think
Mm.
it's often
Have you
deployed
read? Well, okay, that's another subject then. I wonder, have you read Terry Deacon's attempt to?
in complete nature.
No, no, he has an essay specifically on why the meme theory doesn't, from a Peircean perspective, make sense.
Okay, no, I haven't. Yeah, send me that. I think it's a good idea in the sense that Dennett actually highlights cui bono, right? So basically, it's an idea here. It's very Jungian. It's very Jungian in this sense because it's like there are these autonomous factors that inhabit our psyches, brains, minds, whatever, and that they're kind of doing their own thing, and that we might be repeating them or affirming them or whatever, as a result of essentially their own agency and not our agency. There are lots of problems with the meme idea, but at that level, at that very generic level, I think it's a good idea. But I will definitely check out Deacon's. I mean, I've read heaps of anti-mimetic stuff because it never took off. Almost, I may have even read this Deacon article long ago, but there are all sorts of arguments about why it's not a good analog for genes and all of that sort of thing, which are kind of beside the point. I think the cui bono idea, who's benefiting here, and thus the autonomy of the memes is itself a good idea. And on the technology thing, I think that the dismissal of religion, and it's not enabling, like why Jung here is relevant to this discussion of technology, and he gets a bit more explicit about it in the back end. But psychology of religion and kind of like psychology of technology are really super closely related. And lots of people have recognized this, and Eric Davis, who I know he's a friend of yours, and his technosis. But Gilbert Simondon, who we've talked about a number of times, he has this on the mode of existence of technical objects book, and in the introduction, he talks quite a bit there. And this is like in the 50s, and he's very Jungian, right? Like it's mostly cryptic, but he's clearly he does reference Jung, and he's clearly very influenced by Jung. But he talks about how we on the one hand, if we imagine ourselves just as tool using beings, and we imagine these potential artificial intelligences or technology kind of replacing us because it's better at using tools than we are. It's the tool that can use tools, so to speak. Then we make ourselves obsolete in that way. But the counter point, like the technocratic or technophilic perspective, is that we elevate these things to our basically to our salvation, as a principle of salvation. And in both cases, the religiosity gets involved because, on the one sense, we kind of start turning them into evil demons that are going to, exceed us in all these ways and eventually, crush and destroy us. So there's an apocalyptic vision there. And on the other hand, we see them as our salvation. And on both sides of that, we forget that technology is a human thing, that we made it, that we make things, and that we put into it what it has. So it is just an expression of the human. It's like extended phenotype, to use another good Dawkinsian idea. Dawkins had some really good ideas. We can leave that there. But and that's what Jung is really emphasizing for us, right? He's really emphasizing in his discussion our responsibility to our creations, or for our creations. And so God's responsibility, and in the first half, it's God's failure to take responsibility for Satan and for evil, in a certain sense. God is always making himself out to be this, summum bonum, and to the extent that we take over that view from God, that we buy into that, this is very, very
Yeah.
problematic, because it makes us want to emulate this summum bonum and think of ourselves as purely beings of light, and not accepting of our shadows. And Jung, again, it's towards the end, so we'll talk about it more next time, but Jung has a strong warning that if we don't recognize the shadow in ourselves because we repudiate it, those who do not repudiate the shadow, those who are very happy to identify it, sociopaths, psychopaths, basically, will be the ones to take power over our creations, over our technology.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so, yeah, there's lots to talk about the next time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, just the last thing about doubt again, and what I was trying to say about knowledge and faith being inadequate responses because of the way that they oppose each other in, modern culture. Like both faith and knowledge are forms of certainty. And I think certainty is the wrong response to doubt. Like we don't want to leap from one to the other. And as Jung always talks about, the polarities of our complex is that if we're overly doubtful, there's a tendency for doubt to become its opposite through compensation.
In
And
anti-adromia, right?
right. So doubt
Yeah.
becomes certainty, whether for fundamentalist faith or fundamentalist scientism. And I
Mm.
think, finding a mediating position here that is psychologically conscious and sensitive to, these dynamics, these archetypal dynamics that a book like the Bible and a book like Job is trying to display for us. It's an attempt to avoid the collapse of our attention and intention on either of these forms of certainty. And so the question then I think really becomes, what is gnosis? I mean, yes, Jung is giving us a psychological method and a means of healing ourselves, but he's pointing us towards this individuation process that seems to me to be culminating in a kind of
Yeah.
gnosis experience or insight, right?
Yeah, I mean, so the problem with the enantiodromia and the compensatory reaction to this doubt. I mean, a manifestation of that would be someone saying, "Oh well, Jung deals with religious themes. Jung deals with answer to Job. Therefore, there's nothing there. This is bullshit." And that would be the hard skeptical, which is itself a dogmatic reaction, and that's the point, right? That it becomes a dogmatic skepticism. So I totally agree. And just on this gnosis thing, I think you're right, and Jung will use that term explicitly in this essay a number of times, and we should definitely talk about this next time. But to go just full circle to the reception of Jung stuff, and people bring up all the time the famous interview, which you can watch on YouTube, where Jung is asked, so do you believe in God? And he says, I don't believe, I know, and he's very, very, and people are like, oh, look, he's a Gnostic, and he pretends all the time that he doesn't know. But they're just those, again, you
He had a
misunderstand.
mischievous, I would just want to, he had a mischievous grin on his face when he said it. It wasn't like a fervent like assertion. It was a little bit, there was some irony. He was saying it, but he was also like winking.
Well, he's always, there's so much winking in this text. And again, the problematization of omniscience, which I link to all of this stuff about indefiniteness prior to individuation and stuff, is quite funny. Like he makes the jokes a lot. But the key thing I want to highlight with Jung's response there is Jung always problematizes belief, right? He's not a big fan. He says, "I was never blessed with belief." If you have the blessing of faith, then good for you. And I'm trying to bumble around and find my way there. And the philosopher and the psychologist is hoping to be able to recapitulate the insight that and I mean, again, he's being cheeky, but he says that all the time. When he says he knows, he is speaking about psychic reality, which is what Jung is always speaking about. Jung has a very direct, personal relationship with a living God. That's obvious if you read Jung. But it's a psychic reality. So when he says, I don't know, he means metaphysically. That's not my business. And in any case, by the way, and he thumbs his nose at all the theologians, that's ineffable. So how dare you, or why are you talking about and trying, talk about an image, fine. Say that image is identified with God. Whoa, that's like sacrilege. That's blasphemy. So pull your head in, guys. But he's also saying, when he says, I know, he's like, of course, I have empirical experience within psychic reality of my God. That's what he's talking about. And I think people just talk past that all the time when they, again, this Buber Jung thing. Not to say that Buber's not great and doesn't have lots of his own points, but they're talking past each other. And a lot of the reception of that and referencing this particular interview as, oh, well, Jung's caught out there by his spontaneous reaction. It's like, no, that's completely consistent with what he's always been saying. You just have to, who is saying it? Jung is saying it. So in order to understand what he's saying, you have to know what.
I love the irony of his statement. I didn't read last time when we talked about the Buber exchange, but he says in that response, faith is certainly a splendid thing if one has it, and knowledge by faith is perhaps more perfect than anything we can produce with our labored and wheezing empiricism.
Exactly. Like he's likable to me, right? He's not afraid to. I think he has later, if you read earlier Jung, he's quite fascinating and even brilliant in his understanding of the psyche, but he's got a nervous tension in him where he's trying to prove himself and all of that. I think in later Jung, and especially after the black books, and even though he didn't want the red book published, of course, etc., I think he's been through so much that he's just, and especially after 2 heart attacks writing Answer to Job, he's kind of like, it's okay, like, think what you want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's call it quits for now, and hopefully in 2 or 2.5 more hours next week we can get to the bottom of. No, we won't ever hope to get to the bottom of it, but yeah, this has been fun, and I'd say as good a entryway into this text as one could hope for.
Yeah, it's a difficult text which gives rise to a lot of readings. And I actually wanted to say at the beginning, and I didn't, that I don't feel, and I think this is appropriate, worthy of, like anything we say is very provisional, and not just speaking in a theological register or anything, but about this text, Answer to Job, it gives rise to so many different readings.
Yeah, and it's hard to keep up with Jung's wide reading in biblical history and the apocryphal texts and the just all of these Gnostic and esoteric schools of thought that he's drawing in here, and it's very few of us. I'm certainly not competent to actually keep up with his capacity to reference.
Oh yeah, not even remotely in my case.
Yeah.
And I would recommend as a really parting thing that there's heaps of secondary literature on Jung, and a lot of it is of dubious quality, in my opinion. And a lot of Jungian stuff, which is not necessarily on Jung, but is Jungian, is of dubious quality. But if anyone wants to really grapple with Jung, I really do recommend Peter Kingsley's Catafalque. And it's like 2 volumes. The footnotes, which you have to read, are as long as the book. But there he really paints a picture of Jung that to me is really authentic and true to the Jung that I've come to know from reading Jung. And the guy was a serious scholar of comparative religion. And I think there's a lot that he takes for granted in terms of an understanding that he has developed. And I think that's also, there's an irony in the criticism. I don't know if it's an irony, but the criticism of certain theologians, and not to mention people who haven't engaged with this material at all, in their criticisms of Jung. It's like Jung knew a lot of the biblical and extra biblical corpus, the Abrahamic corpus, and its Hermetic and Egyptian and whatever precursors, etc., much better than a lot of the theologians who are criticizing his reception of it.
Yeah, definitely true. All right, Tim. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll connect Monday, was it?
Yeah, my Monday, your Sunday. Will that work?
My Sunday, yeah, perfect. Great.
Man, this is a great pleasure. Yeah.
Hope you feel better.
Yeah, thanks, mate. See ya.
Bye.